August of 1863, New Orleans and much of Louisiana had been under Union control for over a year. President Lincoln ordered Nathaniel Banks, the general in charge of the area, to oversee the creation of a new state constitution. He was able to hold an election in February of 1864 where a Unionist government was elected, and he wrote back to Lincoln that Louisiana would, quote, become in 2 years under a wise and strong government one of the most loyal and prosperous states the world has ever seen. The winner of the governor's race was a German immigrant by the name of Michael Hahn, who ran as a moderate. In March of 1864, Banks and Hahn called for an election of delegates. Although Louisiana had 48 parishes, only those 19 that were occupied by Union forces actually sent delegates. That summer, these delegates met to write a new constitution for the state of Louisiana. The final constitution abolished slavery, granted the right to vote to all white males, gave tax money to educate both white and black children, established a minimum wage, created a 9-hour workday. However, they could not come to an agreement on the right to vote for black men. Still, this was viewed with great optimism by Lincoln and a sign of progress. Lincoln's first speech after the signing at Appomattox referenced Louisiana multiple times. Lincoln said, "Some 12,000 voters in the heretofore slave state of Louisiana have sworn allegiance to the Union, assumed to be the rightful political power of the state, held elections, organized a state government, adopted a free state constitution giving the benefit of public schools equally to black and white, and empowering the legislature to confer the elective franchise upon the colored man." Lincoln went on to say, "It is also unsatisfactory to some that the elective franchise is not given to the colored man. I would myself prefer that it were now conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers." This was the first time Lincoln had endorsed black suffrage, and it would be the only time. 4 days later, he was assassinated. John Wilkes Booth had reportedly been at the speech, and he said to a companion, "That means citizenship. Now, by God, I'll put him through. That is the last speech he will ever make." With Lincoln dead, the Vice President, Andrew Johnson, became president. Johnson was a Southerner and far less sympathetic to the freedmen. On May 29, 1965, Johnson offered amnesty to most former Confederates, meaning Confederates would be able to vote, but black men would not. Predictably, the elections resulted in former Confederates taking positions of power throughout the government and passing a series of black codes. One such example passed in St. Landry's Parish in 1865 read, "Be it ordained by the police jury of the parish of St. Landry's that no Negro shall be allowed to pass within the limits of said parish without a special permit in writing from his employer." In 1866, Congress passed civil rights legislation to try to assure African American votes, but it was vetoed by Andrew Johnson. Congress was able to overcome the veto, giving optimism to some freedmen in Louisiana. The still Unionist Louisiana state governor called for a renewal of the Constitutional Convention for July. Judge R.K. Howell of the Louisiana Supreme Court agreed to preside over the meeting, and it was scheduled for July 30th at noon. As the 25 delegates entered the New Orleans Mechanic Institute, a crowd of about 200 unarmed freedmen, mostly veterans, approached the institute in parade form to display the report. However, recent local elections had appointed John T. Monroe to the office of mayor of New Orleans, a job he had been expelled from just 4 years prior. Monroe declared the meeting was an unlawful assemblage and reached out for law enforcement assistance. And local elections had also brought a new sheriff, a gentleman by the name of Harry T. Hayes, who was a former Confederate general. He deputized a posse of white officers, many of whom were ex-officers, with the purpose of disrupting the meeting. When Hayes and his men arrived, they immediately opened fire on the crowd. General Absalom Baird wired to Secretary of War Edward Stanton that afternoon the following: "Immediately after this riot assumed a serious character, the police, aided by citizens, became the assailants, and from the evidence I'm forced to believe, exercised great brutality in making their arrest. Finally, they attacked the convention hall, and a protracted struggle ensued. The people inside the hall gave up, some who surrendered, and were attacked afterwards and brutally treated." A more detailed report, completed by General Phil Sheridan, noted that the peaceful delegates and supporters were attacked with firearms, clubs, and knives in a manner so unnecessary and atrocious as to compel me to say that it was murder. It was no riot. It was an absolute massacre by police, which was not excelled in murderous cruelty by that of Fort Pillow. It was a murder with the mayor and the police of the city perpetrated without the shadow of necessity. In a matter of just 2 hours, at least 34 African American supporters were killed, while the wounded numbered at least 119. 3 of the delegates who had assembled in the Mechanics Institute were killed, and 17 were wounded. Approximately 200 others were arrested. This event, along with similar events throughout the South, including a similar massacre in Memphis only a week prior, reinforced Congress' belief that the South was not ready to return to the Union. Despite veto attempts by Andrew Johnson, Congress was able to pass legislation that gave freed blacks full voting rights, as well as dividing the former Confederacy into 5 military districts, all overseen by the federal government. Each state was ordered to write a new state constitution that conformed to the rules of the federal government. Louisiana wrote its constitution in 1968. This constitution was the first interracially written constitution in Louisiana and the first to include a Bill of Rights. In addition to extending citizenship and civil rights to all the freedmen, the document also included provisions for integrated public schools, protections for property rights for married women, a mandate for state care of the mentally ill and physically impaired citizens, and eliminated the previous restrictions such as requiring property to hold office and to serve on juries, as well as imprisonment for debt. However, these rights were only limited to those who remained loyal to the Union during the war. There was a requirement for an ironclad oath requiring voters to swear they had never supported the Confederacy in any way. Therefore, anyone who had supported the Confederacy was unable to vote until January 1st, 1878, unless they received a specific granted amnesty. Effectively, this meant the majority of whites in Louisiana had lost the right to vote for at least 10 years. But authority without power is meaningless, and voting is only one way to win elections. Shortly after the Constitution passed in April of 1868, white supremacist groups such as the Knights of the White Camellia began a reign of terror. In St. Landry's Parish, a group of men, mostly freedmen, were protesting the beating of a local schoolteacher. These men found themselves surrounded by a huge white mob. 29 of them were arrested, 27 of them were executed the next day. Over the next 2 weeks, African American families were killed in their homes, shot in public, and chased down by vigilante groups. C.E. Durland, the co-editor of the St. Landry's Progress, a pro-union paper, was murdered and his body was displayed in front of the Opelousas drugstore. By the end, over 250 people were killed. Every pro-union paper was burned, as well as the Freedmen's School. And this was all to accomplish the Knights of the White Camelia's main task. During the presidential election, Ulysses Grant did not receive a single vote in St. Landry's Parish. The local elections officials were fully convinced that no man on that day could have voted any other than the Democratic ticket and not been killed within 24 hours thereafter. The pro-union governor was a man by the name of Henry C. Warmoth. Just 24 years old, he was one of the youngest governors ever elected. Although his election had come almost entirely as a result of the votes of freed blacks, many of his actions led them to distrust him. Warmoth convinced the voters to remove the provisions that prevented Confederates from voting. He even went so far as appointing some former Confederates to office, most notably General James Longstreet. Warmoth also vetoed a bill that would penalize owners of public places and vehicles who failed to provide equal services to blacks and whites. By 1871, his party had turned on him, literally barring him from the convention. By the fall of 1872, Warmoth had left his party and endorsed the opposition, a former lieutenant colonel in the Confederate Army by the name of John McHenry. The election was marred with violence and fraud. The results were unclear. Warmoth, using the power of a governor, declared McHenry the winner, while the legislature declared Kellogg the winner. And this lack of clarity was not just at the state level. Local elections were also affected. In Grant Parish, a black militia dug trenches around the courthouse, hoping to protect the office holders who they believed won the elections fairly. Approximately 150 men guarded the courthouse, while their leader went to New Orleans to seek out federal reinforcement. On Easter Sunday, April 13th, about 300 men, mostly on horseback, armed with rifles, and even having a cannon, arrived at Colfax Courthouse. After making an initial stand, upon seeing the cannon aimed at the courthouse, about a third of the men had tried to flee across the river. They were run down on horseback and killed. What happens next is disputed. All agree that at that point, the defenders waved the white flag, and most of them put down their arms. As the armed white men approached the unarmed black men, a shot rang out, hitting one of the white men. Immediately, the white men began murdering the unarmed black men indiscriminately and burned down the courthouse. A few men fleeing the burning courthouse were initially taken into custody, but later summarily executed. In September of 1874, a white supremacist paramilitary group calling themselves the White League were able to seize New Orleans and the State House for 3 days. Although federal troops were able to come in and push them out, it did show that the Louisiana state government had no real power. 2 days after the attempted coup, the Daily Picayune called for a monument to commemorate the events. In 1882, the city of New Orleans set aside land for a marker. In 1891, a 35-foot granite obelisk was erected. And in 1932, a plaque was added stating the following: McCary and Penn, having been elected governor and lieutenant governor by the white people, were duly installed by this overthrow of the carpetbag government, ousting the usurpers. Governor Kellogg white and the lieutenant governor Antoine colored. United States troops took over the state government, reinstated the usurpers, but the national election of November 1876 recognized white supremacy in the South and gave us our state. The obelisk with this inscription remained there until 2017. History is awkward.